Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive, truly global mystery. How exactly do we measure corruption? I mean, by its very nature, it's something that's literally designed to be hidden in the shadows, right? We so often look at a map of the world and just naturally divide it up into clean nations and corrupt ones. But what if I told you that this neat little division is kind of just an illusion? Because behind those seemingly pristine borders, there's a wild, complex reality playing out every single day. We're talking transnational bribery, massive legal battles, and fines in the billions. So let's unpack the hidden realities of global corruption.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at mapping global corruption. Second, the transnational blind spot. Then, we'll cover America's anti-bribery weapon, the incredibly tricky line between bribes and grease payments. And finally, we'll ask, does policing corruption actually work?
Section 1. Mapping global corruption, measuring the invisible. So how do you even begin to quantify something that happens entirely behind closed doors? Well, first you have to define it. Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And because absolute levels of corruption are pretty much impossible to measure, I mean, nobody's out there handing over their bribery receipts, right? We have to rely on something called the Corruption Perceptions Index, or the CPI. Basically, this index takes a bunch of surveys and expert assessments from groups like the World Bank and the World Economic Forum, and it aggregates them to score countries on just how corrupt their public sectors are perceived to be. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of the divide between the top and the bottom. It is absolutely staggering. The CPI ranks countries on a scale from 0, meaning highly corrupt, all the way up to 100, which is very clean. Looking at the 2025 scores, we see nations like Denmark, Finland, and Singapore leading the whole world, boasting scores way up in the high 80s. They enjoy strong rule of law and super stable political environments. But look at the bottom of the table. The contrast is just stark. Venezuela scores a 10. Somalia and South Sudan, they sit at a 9. These numbers aren't just statistics. They represent systemic, catastrophic failures in public trust and basic governance. And why do these numbers actually matter for us? Well, it's not just about national pride. It's literally about human survival and economic reality. Research actually shows that for every single unit a country's CPI score drops, there is a corresponding 1.7% decrease in GDP growth. That is massive. It completely stuns foreign investment. But even beyond the macroeconomics, it has a devastating human cost. High corruption means equal access to justice basically vanishes. People are forced to rely on personal contacts or flat-out bribes just to be treated fairly under the law. And surprisingly, it even correlates heavily with severe environmental damage, simply because environmental regulations are so easily bypassed with a quick payoff. Section 2. The transnational blind spot, the global loophole. Okay, so here's the twist. That neat map of clean versus corrupt countries, it's really only half the story. Top-ranked countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, who ranked number 6 and 8 respectively in 2025, have incredibly strong domestic institutions. You're definitely not going to get very far trying to bribe a police officer in Stockholm or Amsterdam. However, their fierce commitment to fighting corruption often seems to just vanish when their corporations do business abroad. Take Sweden's state-owned telecom company, Telia Sonera, for example. They faced massive allegations of bribery over in Uzbekistan. Or look at the Netherlands, which actually has a remarkably poor record of prosecuting its own companies that bribe foreign officials to win contracts. That was famously highlighted by a massive Nigerian oil bribery case. So here is the massive issue. Quote, the CPI doesn't capture transnational corruption, so corrupt foreign business practices by companies from these countries don't affect their CPI scores. End quote. This is a massive loophole. A country can have a completely spotless reputation at home, while secretly acting as an exporter of corruption globally. It creates this huge blind spot in how we hold international corporate behavior accountable. Section 3. America's anti-bribery weapon, the FCPA. To try and bridge this international accountability gap, the United States forged a really powerful legal tool. But to understand it, we actually have to go back to the mid-1970s. During the chaotic fallout of the Watergate scandal, investigators uncovered that political slush funds were also being used for international bribery. We're talking over 400 U.S. companies admitting to paying north of $300 million in bribes to foreign officials just to secure favorable action. It was a huge deal.
So, in response to this massive damage to America's reputation, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, was signed into law in 1977. Basically, it made it totally illegal for U.S. persons or businesses to bribe foreign officials. Then, in 1998, it grew some serious teeth. They expanded its jurisdiction to cover foreign companies and individuals if they carry out corrupt payments anywhere within U.S. territory. And this brilliantly illustrates just how aggressively broad the FCPA really is. Because when you hear the phrase foreign official, you probably picture, a politician in a suit or a customs agent at a border. But the FCPA definition covers literally anyone working for a government-owned or managed institution. Are you a pharmaceutical company taking a doctor out to an expensive dinner at a state-owned hospital in China? Well, under the FCPA, that doctor is a foreign official. Bribing an employee of the United Nations? Yep, they are a foreign official too. This wildly expansive net forces multinational corporations to be incredibly vigilant about every single interaction.
Section 4. Bribes versus grease payments. The legal gray area.
But of course, navigating the FCPA is rarely black and white. So the crucial point comes down to this. Under the FCPA, an illegal bribe is a payment made to influence a discretionary decision. Think of paying off a minister to award your company a highly lucrative construction contract. That's a huge no-no. But the law actually contains a specific exception for what are called grease or facilitation payments. These are totally legal, permissible payments made to a clerk or lower-level official simply to speed up routine, non-discretionary duties that they are already bound to perform anyway. Things like processing a visa or turning on the power at a factory. So the line between a perfectly legal grease payment and a highly illegal bribe often comes down purely to the intent and the specific authority of that official. It is a razor-thin wire to walk. And if a company gets that distinction wrong, the consequences are staggering. $800 million. That is the combined penalty paid by the German engineering giant Siemens back in 2008. They paid a $450 million criminal fine to the Department of Justice and another $350 million to the SEC. It was one of the absolute largest penalties ever collected for an FCPA case. And honestly, it serves as a terrifying reminder to corporate boardrooms everywhere of the catastrophic financial risk of failing to police your own ranks in the global market.
Section 5. Policing corruption. Does it work?
All of this brings us to the present day, where we kind of have to step back and question the actual effectiveness of these strict laws. Because despite the billions and billions of dollars in fines and all these high-profile prosecutions, the data paints a pretty grim picture. Looking at 2023, global corruption levels are frustratingly stagnant. Out of 180 countries measured, a massive 118 countries saw absolutely zero significant change in their corruption levels over a 12-year period. In fact, 34 countries actually got worse, while only 28 managed to improve. So despite our absolute best legal efforts, the needle on a global scale is basically stuck. Now, this stagnation has sparked some intense debate, which actually led to a major development recently. In February 2025, President Trump signed an executive order to temporarily pause FCPA enforcement. The argument for this pause is primarily economic. Proponents claim that over-enforcement severely restricts American companies, basically creating an uneven playing field against international competitors who just aren't held to those same strict standards. On the flip side, the argument against the pause, voiced loudly by groups like Transparency International, warns that doing so eliminates the absolute crown jewel of the global fight against corruption. Now, what is truly fascinating here, as noted in a 2026 study analyzing this event, is the immediate market reaction. Right after the pause was announced, the stock value for companies historically linked to corrupt practices received a very noticeable boost. Which brings us to a really complex crossroads. We've mapped out the global illusion of clean countries, we've looked at the sweeping power of the FCPA, and we've explored the fierce, ongoing debate over its actual economic impact. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If strict anti-bribery laws hurt domestic corporate profits on an uneven global stage, but they are fundamentally essential for promoting international justice and human rights, what is the true cost of a clean conscience? And perhaps more importantly, is it a price we are willing to pay? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the world around you, and I will see you next time.